My name is Tom Sear from UNSW Canberra Cyber at the Australian Defence Force Academy. This conference explores a centenary moment of armistice and aftermath for the British Empire in a period of significant change. 100 years ago, power was being negotiated and transferred from Britain to the United States as emergent Asian powers tested their influence. Similarly, in the Indo-Pacific present, we are immersed in a long-term strategic competition, which has re-emerged as China rises to challenge the hegemony of the United States. While the West reflects on the end of the Great War through commemorative rituals established a century ago, the Chinese government looks forward to the commemoration of the effect of the Armistice, the May 4 movement of 1919, and the inception of the Chinese Communist Party in 1921. The era of President Xi Jinping coincides roughly with the centenary of the First World War globally. The Xi Jinping era has seen an emphasis upon memory as a form of state-sponsored national cohesion, and pivotal memorial days in the calendar are commemorated on social media. While the response in China to the end of the First World War between 1919 and 1923 took forms and symbolism radically different to those of the British Empire, and China struggled against the cultural influence of the West in the 1920s, today the memory traditions and cultures the British Empire invented during this time bear some similarity to politicised memory of contemporary Chinese Communist Party. Today, another form of empire is also emergent: digital empires. The internet and social media have transformed political participation within nation-states and empire politics between states. China and the US are involved in a geostrategic technology competition. AI, quantum computing, and biotech will be central to future national power. Just as there is Baidu, Alibaba, and Tencent, or BAT, versus Google, Apple, Facebook, and Amazon, or GAFA, stack-on-stack conflict will take place over access to hemispherical data archives for machine learning. Whether these digital empires will replace nation-states in the future is an open question. However, for the moment at least, the Westphalian system prevails. As Heather Street-Salter has pointed out, we are in the midst of a methodological shift in the study of war and empire. Street-Salter argues for a, quote, conceptualisation of modern empires, which is messier, more multilateral than the colony metropole model allows. Today, I concur with Street-Salter that the colonies and metropoles, particularly via diplomacy and the alliance system of the First World War and the Armistice process, were more connected than we might have imagined, and that peoples were active participants in larger global movements and revolutionary nationalism. To this reformulation, I would like to highlight three other processes. One is not just the error of studying empires as a discrete units, but to stress the importance of exploring empires in friction and entanglement as change occurs. The second is to explore how memory in the present and technological change and commemorative practices have weaponised the historical period 1918 to 1923 as forms of contemporary nation-state-based political mobilisation and censorship. Finally, as great powers begin to be defined by digital borders and their power is articulated through porous firewalls and entangled domains, we may need to look to consider the media archaeology of empires within our methodologies. The telegraph was important to creating connections, just as the internet is today to the integration of Chinese metropole with diaspora. British Empire diplomatic and political efforts at Versailles, which sought to simultaneously maintain influence in China, placate a rising naval power of Japan, and reward that nation for assistance in the First World War, while blunting the power of the United States in the Asia-Pacific as power was transferred, all had unforeseen circumstances in China. Sometime in mid-1916, the combined GDP of the British Empire was overtaken by that of the United States. A transfer of global power and influence had commenced. But how would such transfer manifest itself in the Asia-Pacific? 2 years earlier, in September 1914, Japan occupied the German concession in the city of Qingdao on the Shandong Peninsula, China. In January 1915, Tokyo submitted to Beijing a list of 21 imperialist demands, provoking outrage amongst Chinese students and the wider community. Throughout the war, China had cultivated relations with the United States, hoping it might prove a bulwark against the Anglo-Japanese alliance when peace came. China was to be disappointed at Versailles. London, with so many resources tied up in China and equally frightened of a Japan-US conflict in the Pacific waters, was supportive of Japan. Using its leverage with Britain and President Wilson's fear of a walkout and of Japanese naval power, Wilson, Clemenceau and Lloyd George buckled and gave Japan control of Shandong until 1922. Wellington Koo, the Japanese delegate in Paris, telegrammed Beijing. The day after, enraged students organised a protest on May 4 at Tiananmen Gate. It was this moment that was central to a chain of events that created the Communist Party. May 4 was also an expression of the new culture movement in China. This group had fully embraced Western ideals of Marxism, democracy and the use of vernacular Chinese language in culture. It was a literary movement. Its enduring literary figure was Lu Xun. Lu Xun's intention was Wen Yi Zai Dao, literature as a vehicle for moral message. In 1921, he penned The True Story of RQ, an allegory of a 1911 revolution and a metaphorical parody of traditional culture. The central character had been influential, so much so that the spirit of RQ remains a cliché. If Australia invented the cultural figure of the spirit of Anzac after the First World War as an iconic 20th century civic persona, Chinese political culture enabled RQ. Famous for his self-deception and perverse superiority, RQ is a figure embraced as a critical symbol of the Chinese national character. The Q, which is not really able to be translated into Chinese, is symbolic of the ambiguous feelings for Western culture present at that time. In the months that RQ was serialised in 1921, in Washington, the Naval Conference was underway. The most striking thing about the Washington Naval Treaties of 1923, Corey Shark has observed, was their purpose to prevent Anglo-American competition. Britain remained the world's greatest naval power, but its hegemony was evaporating. It was American power which most threatened the empire, not Japan. Churchill stated of the conference that the US would, quote, have a good chance of becoming the strongest naval power in the world and thus obtaining the complete mastery of the Pacific, unquote. At this conference, China laid out 10 proposals for sovereignty, but it was not to be. The era between 1919 and 1922 witnessed the start of a contemporary Chinese cultural and political consciousness. In China, this national consciousness took the form in RQ and generated a cultural discourse which has, as Paul B. Foster argues, maintained continual relevance throughout the 20th century. In 1938, Mao Zedong called Lu Xun, quote, China's first-rate sage. Confucius was a sage of feudal society, and Lu Xun is a sage of new China. At the same time, the British Empire developed metropole/colony unifying cultural memory tropes that would shape identity and civic participation for the next century. Their peculiar modernity was their unifying real-time quality. The commemorative practices of the unknown soldier, silence, poppies and poetic odes were invented and globally accepted between 1919 and 1922. Developed to cope with trauma, they've become forms of participative collective culture which pivot around memory. These shared symbols and ceremonies which sustained empire were, in the words of Benedict Anderson, quote, ghostly national imaginings. Chinese culture has a long, complex imaginary of ghosts, but for the arc of the communist 20th century, nationalist commemoration of 1919 was future-looking. May 4 has since 1939 been Youth Day, or Qingyangji, and in 1959 celebrated as part of the Great Leap Forward. But just as nations of the former British Empire have recently seen an expansion of memory, so has China, albeit in an ambiguous way. As Ian Johnson points out, the role of history in China during the CCP era is complex, paradoxical, at once integral and sanitised, erased, suppressed and recreated to serve the present. Like the so-called resurgence of Anzac in Australia, even the ritual of Qingming, largely banned during the Mao era, made a comeback in the 1990s. Since taking power as Communist Party General Secretary in 2012 and President in March 2013, Xi Jinping has accelerated a turn towards tradition. Facilitated by Wang Hunming, Mr. Xi has devised the notion of China Dream. Launched just ahead of May 4, 2013, China Dream is number 3 on the Xi Thought Mind Map. Just as those nations involved in the First World War began the centenary process in 2014, so in China a new public holiday was promulgated for September 30, Martyrs' Day. This day is designed to elevate those who died for the nation in the fight against Japan and as part of a long tradition going back to the Opium Wars. Martyr was a term sometimes associated with Tiananmen Square on June 4 and is often censored for the internet. Martyrs' Day has been part of an effort of reclaiming, revisioning the word. The internet has played a critical role in accelerating the engagement with this new memorialisation. China is increasingly digital. However, it has been widely thought the Chinese government has been actively involved in astroturfing, that is, the practice of crowdsourcing what appear to be unsolicited comments to create influence. Such posts in China have become known as 50-cent comments because of the rumour that posters were paid 5 jiao or 0.08 US cents for each post. Commemoration is clearly a significant part of these astroturfing activities. As this graph on screen shows, Qingming, China Dream on May 4 and the relatively new Martyrs' Day are the focus of these postings on social media. This practice has been described as a form of, quote, porous censorship. While readers could seek out information on other memorial protests, it takes time and effort to do so. The flooding of the daily news feed is effectively more of a tax than a ban on information on these key memorial days. Centenaries are also the focus of Xi Jinping's leadership. Soon after becoming leader, Xi specified deadlines for meeting each of his, quote, 2 centennial goals. China will aim to double its 2010 per capita GDP by 2021, when it celebrates the 100th anniversary of the Chinese Communist Party. Second, it will become a, quote, fully developed, rich and powerful, unquote, nation by the 100th anniversary of the People's Republic of China in 2049. For almost a century, May 4 and RQ were a uniquely Chinese take on the remembrance of Armistice and aftermath of the Great War. But from 2007, Lu Xun and RQ were gradually removed from school textbooks. Is his demise because of his moody introspection in an era of China Dream exuberance? Lu Xun has been replaced by other, more foreign memorial forms. Now the memory cultures of the CCP in many ways resemble the mass participative modernist memory cultures the British Empire developed and the transnational technologies of commemoration of which have dominated the British Empire diaspora international memory cultures ever since. May 4, 2019 marks the 100th anniversary of these events in Chinese history. They will be commemorated in China with a new and highly technological conception of history and memory under Xi Jinping's leadership. In 1919, a telegram from Paris concerning Qingdao had ignited a revolution. Now, Qingdao on the Shandong Peninsula is a location of one of the 7 internet submarine landing cable stations in China where, to seek an isolated internet, information is managed and controlled via a complex process of deep packet inspection and VPN management. Lu Xun, author of The True Story of RQ in 1927, said, quote, "I've always felt hemmed in on all sides by the Great Wall, that wall of ancient bricks which is constantly being reinforced. The old and the new conspire to confine us all. When will we stop adding new bricks to the wall? The Great Wall of China, a wonder and a curse." Now, that wonder and curse is the great internet firewall of China. If hegemony of empire is the ability to frame the rules of international engagement and then use those rules to create order amongst other states, the armistice and aftermath of 1919 to 23 did not create peaceful transition between British and US hegemony in the Asia Pacific. The question remains, how will this transition between 2019 and 2023 begin to work itself out between the United States and China? History, memory, and new technological empires will all play a part.